Good day, everyone. My name is Hart Feuer. I'm a faculty member in the Graduate School of Agriculture at Kyoto University in Japan. I'm very pleased that Professor Hanjagi and Divya have invited me here today to give a speech at your conference. I wish that I could join you virtually or even personally, but these are difficult times, and I'm glad that I could join in any form at all to this very valuable event. So thank you very much. The title of my talk today is Cutting Through Static Models of Best Practice in Conservation Agriculture, Sidestepping the Polarized Debate about the System of Rice Intensification. Now, some of you may have heard of this term, System of Rice Intensification, or SRI, and some of you haven't. But those of you who have heard of it probably feel a little bit ambivalent about it. How could a relatively simple set of words create so much divisiveness among researchers of rice? Well, I'm going to try to untangle that today in my talk by using a little bit more social science than might otherwise be used to tackle such a question. And in this, I want to encourage you also to consider social science approaches as a valuable, sometimes invaluable complement to any of the natural science techniques that you already involve. So let me begin. And I want to begin this talk by opening with a discussion about something that I find somewhat shameful in agricultural research. In particular, that we would ever come up with a term best practice. When I think about the context in which such a term might have evolved, I can only imagine arrogant, multilateral, overeducated people without very much field experience. And yet that term persists in use today, despite the fact that we know better. We know that context matters. It's everything. What might be best for some farmer might be to give up the crop that he's growing and switch to a different one. What might be best might be for a farmer to swap land with a different farmer who is more capable. What might be best might even be to abandon certain farmlands. Best is something that we should never have imagined we could achieve. Rather, we should have considered how practices evolve in specific locations and be respectful of those locations, the socio-technical context, and the farming culture in those areas. What is best, or at least what is better in a specific context, is something that we can learn from looking at the history of SRI. SRI is not something that emerged at one moment in time without context. It has a very long history. And in each of the areas in which various ideas that eventually became part of SRI evolved, there was an incredible amount of context, both information gained and information lost, and relevance for local practices. So let's look at the history of SRI together. I hope that all of you will find something interesting or new in this description, as I will go into a few mysterious aspects of its history. Now, the typical history that you will hear goes something like this. A Jesuit priest named Henri de Lologne arrived in Madagascar in 1961. Through his voluntary work with local farmers, he accidentally stumbled upon a package of practices in the early 80s that increased yield, in particular by increasing tillering. And he couldn't explain how this happened, and he cast around for explanations from researchers or from other countries as well. But in the meantime, his work became crystallized as what we now know today as SRI. As the story continues, Henri de Lologne cast about looking for scientific explanations for the enhanced tillering. And eventually he came upon some research that had been conducted in Japan at the turn of the century by a Japanese researcher named Katayama. And he references Katayama numerous times to justify the scientific basis of his discovery. Now, SRI is transported around the world, and this somewhat simplified story suggests that there's a scientific basis and a socio-cultural, socio-technical basis from Madagascar to explain why SRI works. And this is about as much as most NGOs who promote SRI know. But not everyone agrees with it. And to understand why there's such a debate, it's also helpful to look at how this debate evolved, its scope and its scale, which is actually quite significant. Here are some recent titles of journal articles, reports, other documents that either are in support of or strongly against SRI, with a few that are neutral. The red ones obviously against, the green ones supportive, and the gray ones being neutral. Now, this debate reached a certain inflection point in the late 90s, as you can see here, when one of the primary advocates, Dr. Norman Uphoff at Cornell University in the US, started to travel around the world heavily promoting SRI in numerous countries and encouraging young scholars and some seasoned scholars to think about and write about SRI. What occurred in the 2000s was an absolute explosion in the debate about SRI. Now, how could something that has been sitting around since the 1980s suddenly become the object of so much scientific discussion and also personal debate? Well, one of the reasons that the debate became so lively is that the primary advocate, Norman Uphoff, not only succeeded to travel the world quite extensively, including much of Asia, some of Africa, even some parts of Latin America, but also national governments who played or experiment with SRI began to find good results. Here's Uphoff in India, Uphoff at International Rice Conference, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, he's in Bangladesh, he's in Sri Lanka, he's in Delhi, he's everywhere, he's in China, he's back to the Philippines. He was very busy. And naturally, this was somewhat intimidating to the existing framework, which was largely led by the International Rice Research Institute in Los Baños, Philippines. They suddenly began to see Norman Uphoff and the system that he was promoting as somewhat counter-revolutionary. But I will argue that Norman Uphoff might be new, but the idea that SRI or practices, packages of practices like SRI travel the world and gain in popularity, this phenomenon is not new. Before Lologne, SRI-like farming practices experienced numerous cycles of consolidation and popularity, and yes, also critique. To understand what came before, and also to understand that Uphoff's presence was really just a more recent cycle, it is helpful to look back at those who influenced Lologne and even to continue further back. So I'm going to take you in a little bit of a journey into the history of rice farming management practices that are the likely predecessors of SRI. Now, the most direct source for Lolanya was actually 20 years earlier, a rice cultivation manual that he found in Madagascar that was published in 1961 by Doberman. And in this manual, Doberman promoted a few very SRI-like practices, using young seedlings, wide spacing, early weeding, and careful nitrogen fertilization. And the action wasn't all focused on Madagascar. The former agricultural economist and agricultural service agent for the UK in Malaya, so in Southeast Asia now, had published in 1959 a very nice book about rice that cites SRI-like practices going back to the early 1900s. And the last citations are from 1954. All of these predate Lolanya's departure from France to come to Madagascar. So all of this happened and was discussed and was on the public record before this Jesuit priest ever started to make any experimentations in Madagascar. So we're seeing he is not the progenitor, and Norman Uphoff is not the latest advocate. And even the scholar, researcher, who Lolanya cites to prove the basis for the extensive and early tillering arising from SRI, had conducted the work much earlier than is commonly believed. Although the book was published in 1951, his research was conducted in 1920, 1930s, and much of the early findings were published in Japanese. Now, this then predates Grist, predates Doberman, and starts to point at another arena in which the debate about SRI is being waged, which is among researchers, proper researchers, in universities or institutes in Japan. Now, as extensive as the research in Japan was, it turns out that some of the basis for their work had already been established long before by researchers in Germany and Britain, not on rice, but on wheat and barley. Now, of course, they are not the same thing, but some of the principles can be transferred over, and that's in fact what Katayama and his associates did in Japan. In fact, even the idea that the extensive tillering that they found in wheat and barley would be replicable for rice was something that British researchers had already began questioning before Katayama truly began his research on phylocrons and the source of this tillering. And one of his main sources was Engeldow and Wadham. Engeldow in particular had traveled Southeast Asia, India, Africa extensively and had made observations, casual ones, suggesting that tillering would have the same basic structure in rice as they had previously found for barley and wheat. However, one thing we can say is that even before Lolanya, the debate about SRI was not linear. All of these different actors were not promoting SRI, but rather debating it, discussing whether it was relevant in their specific regions of interest and whether it worked or not. And to understand how this noise continued into the present time, it's helpful to see how some of these debates played out in other regions. So let's take a look. An interesting place to start with is actually India. And I particularly like to begin with your colleagues, Guja and Tyagarajan, who seem to have taken everything completely out of context. In a report in 2009, they wrote, if SRI principles are founded on observations of rice plant and how it grows, how come nobody ever noticed until recently? Now, what you've already seen in this presentation suggests to you that people have been noticing this for quite a long time. But nevertheless, socio-technical knowledge like this comes in waves, and oftentimes it's stripped of its context and history. So what we're going to do is actually zoom in a little bit on India and a few other regions to see how a package of practices like SRI can move between one region and another, losing context, being stripped of history, and then re-emerging as a discovery once again. Now, as far as we can tell, in the 1950s in India, what is now understood as SRI, or very similar, was referred to as the Japanese method. Now, that's strange. What about Madagascar? What about Malaya? What about all the other places that we've actually heard about so far? Well, let's keep going back and seeing where this might have come from. Well, in a lot of the colonies, British, French, Dutch, colonial officers found specific methods that they documented which were quite similar. In French Indochina, Dumont in particular in Vietnam found very similar practices. In the Dutch East Indies, Copeland and company found very similar practices. Even in the US Philippines, Rodrigo found similar practices. And the British found as well in Ceylon, in Sri Lanka. And they referenced another person who predated them, in particular the so-called Russian Demtchinsky method. And Demtchinsky, if we go back further, references primordial or ancient Chinese cultivation methods. So there are traces of Japanese influence that you can find here and there, but generally you find farmers doing what seems to be SRI, or very clearly approximations of it, in many different regions, in many different times over the past century or two. Indeed, the Japanese imaginary was so dominant that my colleague, who was at the time of this research working in Wageningen University in the Netherlands, noted that the Japanese method was considered exemplary, kind of the standard, and was credited for introducing what was called India's rice revolution, the one that predates the Green Revolution. So this seems to have more prominence than could have been ignored by Jesuit priests in Madagascar. But how would someone in Madagascar be able to ignore this development going on prior to his own research in India? Well, that's one of the mysteries of socio-technical packages of knowledge, as I said before, being stripped of context and stripped of their history and rediscovered. So then that's our job. What is the context for this Indian SRI of the 1950s? Well, this is not a full history, but if we dig in a little bit, what we find is that the context in 1950s India, post-independence India, was very ripe for kind of indigenous development of rice production techniques. And at the time, an Indian businessman who had been a pre-war resident in Japan and had noticed how the Japanese had practiced rice cultivation, brought a person who we're not sure who his name is, but perhaps Dr. Iwao Kamo, to India to develop what they called the Japanese method. And this eventually gained some traction and was even supported for a time by the Indian agricultural minister, Deshmukh. And for some time there was quite a bit of success. There were test plots that did excellently, doubled or even tripled the basic yield in those regions in India. And even Nehru himself praised these methods in 1953 and used this to criticize the Ministry of Agriculture at the time for giving too much attention to methods from the US and not enough from other Asian countries, which would be more relevant. But all was not good. There were critics as well. Some suggested that the Japanese method was not really new and perhaps not suitable for Indian soils and weather, and not really easily integrated or accepted by local officials and farmers, which would make it a hard sell. Nevertheless, other actors joined into the fray, including the Central Commercial Company of Osaka, which brought a certain patented package, very similar to SRI, which they called the Japanese wave method. So there was quite a bit of buzz about this in the 1950s in India. Here's a nice picture of Japanese volunteer experts who were leading cultivation experts in 1966. What we can see is that the echoes of this method continued for at least 15 years, perhaps longer. And many of the practices that were adopted were now broadly in line with what Henri de Lologne eventually discovered and promoted in Madagascar. And the story in India is not dissimilar to the story in numerous other countries where similar SRI-like methods were discovered by researchers, sometimes colonial researchers, sometimes nationals. For example, in the Philippines, Copeland discovered Dapog method of raising seedlings, which is very similar. But many Filipinos refer to it as the Chinese method. So that suggests that the origin goes somewhere else and perhaps refers to a different time. In the Dutch East Indies, the SRI-like approach was called clean method, and this was promoted by some Javanese farmers who had particularly high yields, and they had various practices that you could find as well in Japan and India and other places in the world as well, such as sorting seeds in salt water. And we have to ask ourselves, how did these influences come to Java? Well, one very simple explanation is that this information is not transmitted by official sources all the time. And it's not documented officially for a long time as well. So by the time researchers and historians catch up to it, we've lost some of the context. In this presentation, we tried to restore some, but it's not always easy. Now, one particular place that we can connect directly back to Madagascar was Vietnam. So in 1935, a French colonial officer documents row planting, spacing, young nursery, some of the iconic aspects of SRI in Vietnam. And he eventually, as you can see here, wrote the preface for the manual of rice agriculture authored by Dobelman for Madagascar. Now, what this means is that Dumont from Vietnam influenced Dobelman in Madagascar, who influenced Didier, who eventually influenced Lologne. So even the direct connection to Lologne can be traced back to a few other countries, definitely Vietnam, and that means another region, and also a very different time period. But if we look even further than these sources, we can find that SRI might have even appeared in India once before the 1950s. In particular, a farmer and entrepreneur named Abranam Pillai in 1906 claims he discovered what is very similar to SRI, economical paddy planting. And a Tamil language article, not much later, promoted similar practices in 1910. But the discussion back then was also somewhat critical. The Agricultural Journal of India and the Indian Agriculturalist in 1907 suggested that some of these economical paddy planting systems and their associated practices were not really suitable for poor soils. But the counter-criticism was that these were researchers or people who did not have experience with SRI or economical paddy planting. And that's why they raised objections. They were prejudiced. Does that sound familiar? That is exactly what has been going on the last 20 years. So if we zoom ahead 100 years, the debate and format of the debate hasn't changed much. Now, a little bit later in India, we find documented from a different person, 1916, a British advisor, who visited a specific model or pilot village that had been adopting the single transplantation system, which was at the time being recommended by the agricultural department, said that they were finding very good results. However, over the long term, even in these areas that Slater documented, SRI was abandoned and perhaps forgotten, which lays the groundwork for it to be rediscovered again in the 1950s as a consequence of Japanese influence. Now, I've already mentioned it before, but it's helpful to put it in its proper time slot as long as we're still going backwards in history. But the Russian Demtchinsky Method, which had been published perhaps prior to all of the activities that we mentioned until now, references the author's travels in China during the Russo-Japanese War. And we don't know where he gets this claim, but Demtchinsky suggests that the methods he's referring to are at least 3,000-year-old very common Chinese cultivation methods that are meant to promote tillering through specific way of transplanting and spacing of the rice hills. And not dissimilar to Nehru, 50 years later, he blames Western science for ignoring these sort of physiological, very important physiological aspects of rice development. And Demtchinsky gets a sort of second life, rediscovered later in Western European agricultural literature as being one of the progenitors of Ackerbait-Kultur, which is a form of agriculture that became common in the German-speaking world for wheat and barley tillering. So again, rice may have influenced wheat and barley, which may have come back and influenced rice again, as discovered by Katayama and his researching pals 20 years later. However, even at that time, there was some noise, and the Dutch East Indies administrator, Miyazaki, suggested that this Demtchinsky method, which he had heard about, was much ado about nothing. Now, if we keep going back, we find that the influence of the Japanese at the time and also in subsequent periods is not coincidental. The Japanese had been developing very somewhat unique approaches to rice cultivation. And some of these things later became quite strongly associated with SRI, even if they weren't directly understood to be of Japanese origin. And one of these was the rotary weeder. Now, of course, there's a sort of mythos about how this was invented, but in the 1890s, there's definitely evidence, perhaps the first evidence of the development of rotary weeder designed for smallholders. And this appears as a key aspect of the SRI labor-saving techniques in many subsequent periods. Now, the influence of the Japanese must go back further because at least in the basic research that I've done here in Japan, and probably if I did this type of historical research in other countries, I would, with good documentation, I could track a similar narrative. But what we can say is that very similar SRI-like practices appear even as early as the Edo period in Japan, in particular in perhaps the most famous agricultural textbook in Japanese history, the so-called Nogyo Zensho, which was written by Miyazaki Yasusada, an itinerant farmer and scholar who traveled in China, came back to Japan, and eventually promoted a wide range of agricultural practices, from horticulture to arboriculture to rice agriculture. And his influence really cannot be understated. Now, the practices that I'm referring to appear in the Edo period and are remarkably similar to the SRI practices that we are still promoting in this day and age. In particular, row planting, intensive weeding, fewer seedlings, and if you look as early as 1790 to 1810, a precision nursery, only taking the highest quality stems for transplanting and using less seeds. In other words, investing a lot more in the most vigorous and healthy seeds. And again, 120 years ago, what the Demtchinskys, as well as now noted in Thomas Smith's Agrarian Origins of Modern Japan, is that these SRI-like practices always faced the same fundamental problem, that they were laborious, intricate, and time-consuming. They required farmers to be more skilled, and they required farmers to have access to an amount of labor that in certain contexts would simply not be possible. And even the Demtchinskys suggested that what was at that time not called SRI but precision agriculture would only be suitable for very small scale operations. Now, here's where I want to stop. Now, I can dig through the history even further and find waves upon waves of forgetting and rediscovering SRI in different contexts. But I think the point has been made. Now I want to move on to a new point which wraps all of these together, and namely skill. Skill of the farmer. What is a good farmer? Because it turns out what all of these colonial historians, colonial agricultural authorities, what Lolania, what Didier, what everybody discovered in their respective contexts was simply the activities of good farmers. Farmers who had good instincts, farmers who had good conscientious practices, farmers who were committed to their craft. And eventually they would document those practices, and it turns out, voila, those practices turn out to be similar across different regions. Because rice is not so dissimilar across different regions. And you can always find someone who is growing rice in a similar climatic zone or soil zone as you are. But what then matters is what you do with it. Now we call that management, but I'm going to switch and call that skill, because management somehow refers to some kind of a modernized concept of how farmers should behave in specific socio-technical contexts. But skill is a more general term to refer to the ability of farmers to adapt to specific environmental conditions, use the labor efficiently, and recognize the inherent genetic potential of the rice that they are interacting with. So what I'm suggesting is that we can wrap up this debate by going back to a far more basic idea that good farmers will always be something of note. That we will observe this guy has really high yield, what is he doing? And this guy has really high yield under adverse conditions, what is he doing? And our curiosity about how good farmers manage under their different contexts leads us to create a certain mythos about the practices that they engage. But behind those practices, which we can codify, are the skills, the intuition, the experience of the farmers. And these are often underappreciated because we cannot codify them. We prefer to, or we hope to, consolidate a system, definitive agricultural practices that we can replicate in other contexts and replicate with some type of precision in a way that we can say more objectively, this is what any farmer could do, right? And this is perhaps why the term best practice emerged, because people always talked about the best farmer in the region, the best yield in the region. And this leads us to get very excited and to want to take the mythology and make it something concrete that we can replicate. Now, I will argue in the next step that management practices like SRI don't necessarily influence yield directly. They are wrapped up in the overall skill set of the farmer. So a very skillful farmer will be able to integrate good management practices readily because they are logical to him or her. A farmer who's inherently not a very good farmer, and we won't speculate about what that is, probably will struggle or resist against changes. In my research as well, over the past 15 years, there have been moments where it was tempting to believe that when I observed farmers implementing SRI in some form or another, mostly in Cambodia, that it worked. They learned something from some type of agent, extension worker, or NGO worker and applied it, and their yields increased. But eventually I found it was not so simple. So the oversimplification that I found, which could easily be misinterpreted, is that plots in which SRI was implemented in some form or another yielded 33 to 68% higher than non-SRI plots. Now, if you stop there and say, okay, let's make this a national policy, you'd be missing the point. And probably the policy would fail. And I'll tell you why. Because understanding marginal yield increases somehow assumes that we can measure or benchmark the pre-existing practices that farmers have. And it turns out that good farmers have inherently practiced a lot of the individual practices that are associated with SRI. And therefore, when SRI is overlaid on top of these farmers, not much changes, which suggests that good farmers won't actually get much benefit, and poor farmers may not be skilled enough to implement it. In other words, there were already structural or social or technical impediments in the way. So what I did to cut through all this is I just went and ignored what SRI is per se and just measured farming practices. I asked some of the best farmers in the regions that I was working to walk me through step by step what they do in the preparation phase and all the way through to the end of harvest. And then I took those individual practices, codified them in a certain way, as you can see here, and went and measured them with other farmers. And it turns out seedling age, the amount of stems you put per hill, how deep you transplant the rice, of course these things are relevant. The farmers already have a certain opinion or a certain practice about these. And many of them were already right on. They were doing things in a fairly effective method to begin with. But by just measuring what farmers do and ignoring what SRI prescribes they do, I could just uncover what were, for lack of a better term, good farmers and not so good farmers. And here's where the mystery starts to get resolved. And I'm not talking about the mystery of SRI itself, but the ancient mystery, the one that goes back at least 120 years and is suggested by Smith in Japan, that skillful farmers eventually have better yields. And whatever you can do to make farmers more skillful will increase their yields. Now, that's not very revolutionary. And for those who wish to promote a certain standardized package, this is a bit dismaying, but it can also be empowering. Now let's see why. Now, one way we can get an idea about this is by just simply associating what I measured, which is cultivation skill. What is a good farmer and not so good farmer, with eventually what is prescribed by SRI. And so I'm comparing farmers who have no contact with SRI, who've never heard of it, but are simply good farmers, with those who are now practicing SRI. And it turns out that they're actually very similar. That skillful farmers and SRI farmers are much the same thing. So it turns out what we are doing by promoting SRI, promoting certain practices, is encouraging farmers to be more skillful, more specialized, more artful, more crafty in the way that they do their work. While we would like to believe that we are telling them to do individual practices, such as spacing their seeds or planting the seedlings more shallow or using younger seedlings, and that these are the magical tricks that these things inspire farmers to become more reflective, more skillful, more observant, more conscientious farmers, and eventually that brings dividends in terms of higher rice yields. And we can see that in a rough, not so rough, but not comprehensive model that I conducted in Cambodia, which in one case models SRI, which is essentially a reported aspect. They say, I am doing SRI, partially or fully. And in the other model where I just put their skill, which I've already enumerated through factor analysis. And it turns out that the model that incorporates skill, which is here, has a better fit than the model that incorporates SRI quality. And while fit is not going to explain everything, it's already removing some of the unknowns. And the unknowns here are pretty significant because, of course, what affects yield is far beyond the variables that I could list here. Includes weather and many other external factors that we cannot really codify. But cultivation here is, in short, a slightly better predictor and a more objective one about yield. Which is to say that if we want to know why farmers are able to achieve higher yields, we have to look at not the direct route through applying some new management practice, but through the indirect route of that management practice, encouraging them to reflect, reshuffle, reconsider, and become more thoughtful about all of their farming practices in a more generalized sense. So sometimes SRI or the promotion of SRI in a certain area may simply have an indirect impact of encouraging farmers to reconsider or to put more effort in or to be more conscientious about the farming that they are already doing. Now, the fact that we are considering what is a good farmer suggests to us why and how the debate about SRI currently is not new. It is as primordial as the first reaction 10,000 years ago of one neighbor to another saying, my neighbor got more yield than me. What is he doing? Let me try to replicate that. Oh, wait, I can't replicate that because he is right next to a river and I'm not. Oh, I can replicate that because we have the same soils. So these types of discussions, over and over and over, in different contexts, in different time periods, different political regimes, different labor regimes, they're going to define whether or not what is a good practice, what is the optimal practice for growing rice can be achieved, is relevant, is useful, and is part of the political and technical discourse. So yes, this is not a contemporary debate, it's a primordial one, but at least for the past 700 years that I documented in this talk, we can see some of these cycles. So I document these cycles as they've evolved in Asia over the past 700 years, with a specific focus on its origins in Japan, where we have good records of the so-called precision farming. And these farming methods not spread to China. Of course, they may have also come from China, just as the historian of the famous Japanese textbook had traveled in China. But as the knowledge moves back to China or moves to Japanese colonial holdings, the knowledge of where those practices came from is lost. In other words, there were no clear patents and trademarks on this knowledge that can help us trace its origin and heritage. But this perhaps does suggest why, over the long term, researchers and scientists or interested agricultural observers would want to prove how or why precision agriculture, or SRI, works. And perhaps this is why the Japanese with rice and the British and Germans with wheat and barley were some of the first to explore the potential for extensive tillering and early tillering. And the cycles of disruption and rediscovery of SRI are probably related to context. Knowledge, labor, availability of water, certain land tenure system that facilitates it, and various periods of, let's say, agricultural de-skilling or reskilling could occur as various paradigms shift, political ones or periods of promotion by something like a Ministry of Agriculture. So, for example, high-yielding varieties in India turned out to yield more with less effort, which resulted in some unlearning of the laborious Japanese method. Just as political changes in the early Edo period encouraged nuclear family farming and allowed for a lot more intensive labor to be employed and led to a renaissance of precision farming. So cycles come and go. And my last point was not a revolutionary one, but one that we could do well to remember, that good farmers coincidentally also do good management practices, or in this case, often do SRI. There is an overlap, even among farmers who have never been exposed to SRI. They have simply used their intuition and their experience to optimize their rice yield, and in doing so have stumbled across what would later be, or in another context, be labeled SRI. So in that sense, SRI is neither a farmer revolution, it's just good skillful practice, nor is it a scientific fraud. No one is promoting anything that doesn't work historically or otherwise, but it is a gathering of emphasis on well-worn practices that is part of a cycle of excitement, forgetting, and rediscovery, which we are probably likely to repeat once or twice again before we finally get a handle on it. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for listening and continuing along this journey with me, a somewhat unlikely journey. And as I said in the beginning of the talk, a somewhat social science focused take on what others might have tried to resolve with primarily natural science means. And I hope through this that I've proved to you that many of the debates that are being waged in agricultural sciences about what farmers should do, where and when, many of them can be resolved perhaps in a more socially, culturally, and politically respectful way with a dose of social science before we bring out the heavy guns and start measuring yield and start measuring nitrogen and start measuring soil quality. Stop for a moment and think. The cost of social science, a little bit, will be low. The cost of implementing a major test of SRI can be very high. There is a more efficient way to resolve many of our questions, and we should at least give it the chance before we start down the more acrimonious path of natural science debates. Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers, and please enjoy the continuation of your conference. Best wishes from Kyoto, Japan. Thank you very much. Have a good day.